Before we start, I'd like to thank Ubisoft for providing me with early access to this game. So after multiple delays, Assassin's Creed Shadows is finally here, and this entry marks a major technical leap for the series, as this is the first game in the franchise designed exclusively for current-gen consoles and PC, and to support that, Ubisoft's in-house Anvil engine has received a significant update to deliver what I believe is arguably the biggest visual leap in the series since Unity. Among the many improvements, the new weather system and comprehensive physics stand out, not only enabling elements like vegetation, cloth, and other objects to be dynamically dismantled, but also allowing characters to interact with particles in a more natural and responsive manner, which makes the environment feel more dynamic, reactive, and alive. However, the most impactful visual enhancement comes from the addition of Ray Traced Global Illumination, and its impact can be seen everywhere. And here, by switching between the Bake GI solution and RTGI, we can clearly see how even the lowest diffuse RT setting completely transforms the look of the game by making colors pop more and adding so much realism to the visuals. It's also evident that the game's art direction was built with RTGI in mind, as Ubisoft did not put as much attention into the Bake GI solution. And all these technical improvements, of course, come at a performance cost, as the game is quite demanding on both the CPU and GPU. In terms of performance stability, the game does not suffer from noticeable stuttering, and the frame time graph is mostly flat. However, under certain scenarios, specifically in towns, running the game at high frame rates can disrupt the stability of the frame time graph, causing noticeable spikes. I also encountered some weird performance behaviors from the game. For instance, when traversing the world, performance can drop significantly, as you can see here, but if I stop moving, the FPS goes back up. I'm not entirely sure what's causing this, but I suspect it could be related to direct storage implementation or the Micropolygon geometry system, which is similar to Unreal Engine 5's Nanite, as the game becomes particularly heavy in towns and villages where this technique is used more extensively. I also noticed that loading a save can sometimes result in a lower performance than before. For example, after loading this save from the main menu, I get around 54 to 55 FPS, which is noticeably lower than what I had in this specific area before returning to the main menu. However, if I adjust any setting like terrain quality, by lowering it and then pushing it back to its original stage, the performance increases to around 62 FPS. And this is definitely something Ubisoft should look into and iron out, as the game could use more polish in terms of performance. So with that out of the way, let's get into the settings, starting with image quality. This game supports 4 upscaling techniques: DLSS, FSR3, XeSS, and a TAA upscaling solution or TAAU. When using 44% of 1440p on each upscaler, we can see that FSR3 struggles with certain effects. For example, particles and fire effects look noticeably worse compared to XeSS or TAAU. The same applies to rain particles, where FSR3 has a hard time resolving individual raindrops. However, when it comes to motion stability, FSR3 performs better than TAAU, though XeSS still holds a slight edge in that regard, and as expected, DLSS delivers the best overall image quality. This game is supported on the NVIDIA app, which allows overriding the new DLSS transformer model. Although this model offers better motion clarity and improved texture detail at around a 7% cost, it suffers from trailing behind moving particles when using either preset J or preset K. And this issue is even more noticeable with effects like raindrops, as you can see here. And since particles are everywhere in this game, this issue becomes particularly noticeable when using the transformer model, so I generally don't recommend it for this game. The game also supports both DLSS and FSR3 frame generation, and I have to say that the implementation of FSR3 frame generation is quite good, with minimal input latency when using a controller as long as the base performance hovers around 50 FPS. But as I said before, I am not particularly sensitive to input lag, so your mileage may vary. The only issue with FSR3 FG as usual is the UI elements, which update at a lower rate compared to the rest of the image, making them somewhat without distraction. And here during fast movement with 20% speed, you can clearly see the generated or fake frames. But if I play both sides at full speed, you can see that those generated frames are far less noticeable. As for DLSS frame generation, its implementation is also solid. And while the frame time graph may appear erratic, the readout from XeSS is inaccurate in this case and the game feels smooth. This is due to the need of a new metric to properly capture frame times when using the latest DLSS 4 frame generation, which XeSS does not support yet. And here the key difference compared to FSR3 frame generation is that DLSS handles the UI elements much better. Now I don't usually recommend frame generation, but in this game if your base performance is around 50 to 60 FPS and you have enough VRAM to spare, I think it's worth enabling frame generation to further smooth out the gameplay. But now let's see how we can hit that 50 to 60 FPS target by tweaking the graphics settings, starting with Ray Traced Global Illumination. Now RTGI is forced in the hideout area because according to Ubisoft, this location offers extensive customization, making pre-calculated global illumination techniques unfeasible. And outside this area, ray tracing can be disabled. Here we can see that enabling diffuse RT can cost up to 14% on the 3060 Ti, which is the largest impact I have seen with this GPU, at least in the starting area. And adding specular RT or RT reflections on top at ultra high leads to an additional 12% performance hit. As for CPU performance, with the 4070 Super in this town, we can see that the average performance impact is quite similar to what we saw with the 3060 Ti, with diffused and specular RT each reducing performance by around 14%. However, when GPU bound, the impact of diffuse RT becomes less significant, costing around 9%, while specular RT has a higher performance cost of about 19%. As for the Ray Tracing Quality setting, this controls the accuracy of RTGI. Going from low to medium significantly improves the lighting quality by adding more bounced lighting and enhancing ambient shading. However, moving beyond medium does not offer the same level of visual improvement as you can see here, and at 1440p with quality DLSS, even ultra high exhibits noticeable noise, though going above low slightly reduces it. For specular RT, using low leads to noticeable noise on reflective surfaces, and performance-wise when both RT effects are enabled, increasing the setting from low to medium costs around 5%, while pushing it further to ultra high reduces performance by about 7%. And the last RT setting is BVH Quality. This one controls the geometry used for ray tracing and determines which objects and surfaces receive RT effects. And as you can see here, going from low to medium and high applies ray tracing to more distant objects, and going further does not add much visually. Performance-wise, at least in this area, this setting has negligible impact. As I mentioned earlier, diffuse RT is transformative and adds a lot to the game's visual presentation. Specular RT on the other hand has a large performance impact and its visual benefits are limited by the low BVH quality. Even at ultra high, RT reflection still relies on screen space information to fill in the gaps. So if you have a capable GPU, enough VRAM, CPU power and performance to spare, I recommend enabling diffuse RT at medium with high BVH quality as the optimized RT settings. However, with something like the 8GB 3060 Ti, enabling ray tracing might not be the best idea, but I'll show you how these optimized RT settings perform on this GPU at the end of the video. Let's move on to the lighting section, which includes screen space effects, light source quality, and shadow quality. Screen space effects subtly impacts SSAO and SSR on rough surfaces, but it does not affect screen space reflections on smooth, highly reflective surfaces like puddles as you can see here. Performance-wise, this setting has no noticeable impact, so leave it at high. Light source quality mainly affects the amount of shadows cast by artificial light sources like candles, torches, etc. And here we can see that shadows start appearing at high and above, though with other light sources like this lantern, we can see that only ultra high produces shadows. Performance-wise, this setting is demanding. Here going from low to high costs around 9%, to very high 14%, and to ultra high 16%. So for this one I recommend medium. But if you have performance to spare, consider using high to add shadows from some light sources. Shadow quality controls both the resolution and raw distance of shadows, as you can see here. From medium, more shadows become visible at a distance, while high and above add even more and improve shadow map's resolution. And this is one of the most intensive settings. Here, going from low to medium costs around 3%, high 8%, very high 14%, and ultra high a hefty 26%. So similar to the previous setting, I recommend medium or high. Moving on to texture streaming pool. This setting determines how much VRAM is allocated to texture streaming. On the 3060 Ti, I couldn't notice any difference in texture quality between the options. However, using very high or ultra high significantly increases VRAM allocation. So since texture's quality remains unaffected, I recommend medium or even low for 8GB GPUs to avoid any potential performance issues related to VRAM usage. Let's move on to the effects section, which includes post effects, water quality, and particle quality. Post effects enables lens flare and slightly improves bloom quality, with no noticeable performance impact. So if you like these effects, keep it at high. Water quality has minimal visual impact, with high and very high showing slightly more defined foam crests on these waves. However, the performance impact is quite significant, with around 9% when going from low to high and 13% when going to very high. So for this setting, I recommend medium. Particle quality adjusts the quantity of certain particles, specifically raindrops, as you can see here, where low and medium show slightly fewer raindrops compared to the higher options. Performance-wise, this setting has no noticeable impact in this area, but I recommend keeping it at high as it might affect performance on more CPU-intensive scenarios. Moving on to the geometry section, which includes loading distance, drawing distance, and micropolygon. Loading distance affects the level of detail of certain elements and has a noticeable impact on the draw distance of specific types of foliage like grass, as you can see here. In terms of performance when CPU bound in this area, I measured around 3% when going from low to high and 6% when going to ultra high. So for this one, I recommend high, but if you have a weaker CPU, consider dropping it lower. Draw and distance, on the other hand, does not have a significant visual impact. It mainly affects the visibility of some distant foliage and the amount of detail on certain trees. Performance-wise, when CPU bound, it has a similar impact to loading distance. However, due to its minimal visual impact and the fact that popping isn't noticeable even on low, I recommend keeping it at low as a safe option. Micropolygon adjusts the amount of VRAM allocated to virtual geometry rendering, and visually there is no noticeable difference between low and high, and static geometry utilized in this new micropolygon system shows no noticeable pop-in even on low. Performance is also identical, however high uses slightly more VRAM, therefore I recommend low, especially if you have an 8GB GPU. Let's move on to the terrain section, and here we have terrain quality, deformation, scatter density, and virtual texture. Terrain quality controls the quality and raw distance of tessellation applied to terrain surfaces, which affects the geometric detail and level of bumpiness of the terrain. And in terms of performance, only the higher options show a noticeable impact, so for this one I recommend high. Deformation controls how deformable terrain surfaces react to interactions from characters and objects, and it also affects interactive vegetation. Like here, notice how the grass responds more naturally when using medium or high compared to low. Performance-wise, this setting has no noticeable impact, so I recommend leaving it at high. Scatter density sets the amount of grass and flowers scattered throughout the world, but it's hard to notice a visual difference because even the lowest options maintain a fairly dense vegetation coverage. Performance-wise, only ultra high has a noticeable impact, so I recommend keeping this one at high. Virtual texture mainly affects the resolution of terrain textures, and as you can see here, the performance is nearly identical across all three options, but there is a noticeable increase in VRAM usage, so for 8GB GPUs I recommend keeping this one at medium. Moving on to the character section, which includes two settings, character quality and hair strands. Character quality adjusts the LOD of NPCs and the draw distance of their shadows, as you can see here, where low and medium show noticeable shadow and LOD pop in. Performance-wise, when CPU limited, there is a noticeable impact at higher settings, with very high costing around 3 to 4% and ultra high around 10%. So for this one I recommend high. Hair strands determines how many characters receive the higher fidelity hair rendering. Player only enables it for the player character, low disables it for most NPCs, medium enables it for nearby characters, and high applies it to even more. However, even with high hair strands don't seem to apply to all NPCs, and there is a noticeable hair popping even when character quality is set to ultra high. As for the performance, enabling hair strands for the player costs around 4%, while setting it to high for more characters increases the cost to around 8%. But in some other scenes like here, particularly when the camera is close to the hair, the player only option can cost up to 10%. So generally if you are struggling with performance, I recommend turning this off. But if you have performance to spare, it's worth enabling hair strands only for the player. And lastly, we have the volumetric effects section with two settings, cloud quality and fog quality. Cloud quality adjusts the detail and density of volumetric clouds, and there is around 9% performance cost when going from low to high, very high and ultra high. Therefore, I recommend medium cloud quality. Fog quality adjusts the resolution of volumetric fog, and surprisingly this setting doesn't seem to have a significant performance impact. But despite that, I recommend keeping it at high to stay on the safe side. So given everything we've discussed so far, these are my recommended settings for Assassin's Creed Shadows. Now let's compare the performance of the optimized settings and ultra high preset at 1440p using quality DLSS. I also added dynamic resolution with a range of 25 to 44% and a 60 FPS target to the comparison. And DRS does not entirely fix the drops in this village, but helps keep performance closer to 60 FPS. And it's a good option if you prefer not to use frame generation. And here going from ultra high preset to optimized settings improves performance by around 51%. Finally, here is how enabling ray tracing with the optimized RT settings on the 3060 Ti looks and performs compared to the raster optimized settings. And with that we arrive at the end. Thank you so much for watching and for your time. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like, and if not, leave a dislike. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for future videos, and hopefully I'll see you all in the next one.